Did you know that buying a house today is tougher than it used to be? With rising prices, hard competition, and limited options on the market, many people find it hard to buy a home today. Today, I will show you how I bought a 3,000 square foot, 4 bedroom, 3 bath home in California with family group economics. So stay tuned. My name is Jermaine McNeil, and I've been in the debt collection industry for over 15 years. This gives me a unique perspective with the main thing that I do, which is credit restoration on the personal side and business side. For years, I've been the go-to guy for friends and family with regards to credit and debt, and now I'm going to be that person for you. Today, you will learn how I was able to get a piece of the American dream by using family group economics. The truth is, without this strategy, I'm not sure if I would have been able to buy a house at all. What is family group economics? To explain that to you, I'm going to give you a couple of stories. The first story starts when I was about 11 years old. I grew up in Southeast San Diego, and I used to walk to school. And I believe it was elementary school at this time. I walked to elementary and junior high, but nevertheless, I remember I would stop and I had an Asian friend that I had grew up with, and I would stop at his house to pick him up to go to school. And normally in the mornings when I would walk past his house, he would already be outside. He would wait for me and we would walk to school. But on this particular day, in the morning, I'll never forget. Well, as I was walking to his house, I didn't see him outside of the house. So I thought, you know what? I'll just go knock on his door. I go knock on his door and he opens the door. And when he opens the door, when I look inside of his house, I see bunk beds all over in the kitchen, in the living room. And I knew that there were a lot of people who lived inside of that house. But, I was never really all that nosy. I just figured, you know what? Maybe he was poor. So that was my first time seeing something like that ever. Now, fast forward, probably about the time I was 18 or 19 years old, I was sitting in front of my grandmother's house. And in front of my grandmother's house, we live right on the corner. And this street, a lot of cars pass by. And I happen to be out on the porch to where people can see us. And my grandmother's lived at this house for over 50 years. So a lot of times when people stop, probably 80% of the people will look and say hi or ask about my grandmother or something along those lines. And this time, I remember as the car was approaching, I could hear a lot of music going on. And it was, rap music. It was some popular song at the time. And he had a lot of bass. Whoever this person was had a lot of bass in their car. And as it came closer, it was a white M3 BMW. And when I looked inside of it vaguely, I could see it sort of kind of looked like somebody I knew. And so I waved. And guess what? It was that friend who I used to walk to school with. As soon as I noticed it was him at 19 years old, seeing him in a car like that, I was like, hey man, pull over, pull over. He pulls over and he stops and we begin to start talking. Now, let me explain something to you guys. Being in Southeast San Diego, 80% of the people that I grew up with at that time span, and sorry for those of you who watch this, but if you see an individual in a car like that, bumping music, he had on some gold chains, nice earrings, the outfit was cool, naturally, I would assume that they're doing something illegal, right? Scamming, selling drugs, something along those lines. And when I asked him, I was like, man, hey, bro, how'd you get a car like this at 19? He said, you remember when we were younger and a lot of people lived inside of this house? He was like, it was my cousins, aunties, nephews, and nieces. And what we did was we all put our money into a pot. And eventually he bought a home. He said he owned 2 homes. His brothers owned homes. His mom owned homes. They owned apartment complexes and so forth. But that was my introduction to group economics. Obviously, I didn't know what that was at the time. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, that's pretty cool. But that was my first encounter with family group economics. The second time is after graduating, shortly after graduating, I moved in with a coach of mine that I had from high school. And I'll never forget, we're sitting down and we're eating at the dinner table. And as we're eating at the dinner table, they start discussing finances. So within my household, obviously being raised by my grandmother, who was basically a single parent raising 7 grandkids, one of the things we never did was we never discussed finances. I had no idea how much she paid for the mortgage on the house. I had no idea, how much her bills were for the most part. But what I did know is that if I wanted something that was a little out of range that she couldn't afford to pay, that she just couldn't afford to pay it. But going back to this dinner at my coach's house, they express everything as far as finances goes. In that little short 20-minute time, I knew how much they were paying for their mortgage, and I knew how many bills that they had and how much money was left over because they were open in explaining those economics with their kids. That was my second introduction when it came to family group economics. In the first situation, we have people all coming together and within a family to put money together and then to move forward. And then in the second situation where the family actually discussed finances, right? A lot of times within my family, we didn't know what anybody had until they actually passed away. Once they passed away, either we were doing a GoFundMe to actually try and bury them, whether they were old or young, or they died and you found out there were a lot of stuff. Like in an instance with my great grandmother, I had no idea, but she owned commercial property. She owned, apartment complexes, and she had businesses. But she lived in the same house, and so when you would look at everything, they were never really flashy. So I had no idea until she actually passed, and then I realized within the passing because my grandmother and her sisters and brothers were arguing over a lot of their assets. And that's when I found out she had a lot of stuff. And then the last time I learned or I seen something when it came to group economics was back in 2018, 17. I was driving for Lyft and Uber. If you know me, one thing about me is when I was driving, I loved doing it, not because of the money necessarily, right? Obviously, I would make money, I would take care of bills and odd bills that we had. I just loved communicating, right? One of the things that I learned through driving through Lyft and Uber, which I did both, is when I would pick up people, I would have conversations with people that on a normal daily basis, I just wouldn't meet these people. And being from San Diego, you get a lot of tourists. And I'll never forget, obviously I had a 8-passenger van that I would pick people up. I was up north. I ended up picking up a family and taking them to the San Diego airport. And this family, I believe, was Indian, but they were from Australia. And how I found that out is obviously because I'm going to talk. And so the father of the family sat in the passenger seat and everyone else was in the back. So as I loaded all of their stuff and we started on the journey, we started talking. During our conversation, I discovered that not only were they going on a family vacation here in San Diego, but they were sort of kind of traveling the world. They were doing a bunch of stops. And so naturally, I inquired and I asked and I said, well, how are you guys able to afford to do this? And then he sort of kind of chuckled, but then he told me the situation. He said within Australia, he has like a group of people that were, they're basically all, I believe, like Indians. And they were all foreigners that came from India to Australia. And so he said they started out by putting money into a pot and they called it a bank. So every single month, it was, I believe, like 10 families at one point when they started out. And they would all put money into this pot. At the end of the year of saving up, they would give it to one family. And then every 6 months, as they're putting money into this pot, they would give it to each family. And so every time that money came about, they would take that money and then they were able to purchase a grocery store, eventually buying other businesses. And those 10 families would always buy from whatever those businesses are. And then as they made more money, they would contribute more money into the pot. And it grew and grew and grew. And he said eventually all 10 families owned properties. They had all businesses, different types of businesses, and they all interacted and worked within themselves. And then I said, well, okay, so that makes sense. So how did the vacation comes up? He said, we constantly been doing it. He's been doing it for over 12 years, he said. And he said with the money that they got this time, because they had the businesses, they had all the stuff, they decided to go on a family vacation. And I thought, how cool is that? Given those 3 stories, I'm going to give you what a definition of what family group economics is. It's where a family pools together their finances and resources to achieve a specific goal. So now let me get into how it was I was able to get a piece of the American dream here in California and purchase our first home. It all started, I met my wife 11 years ago. Within a year of knowing each other, we moved in together. One of the things that I noticed in our first apartment is that we live close to her parents. And we interacted with their parents, and she's really close with her parents, and we would travel, do all types of stuff. Then, as time progressed, we end up moving again. And we moved literally about a 2-minute drive, maybe a 5-10 minute walk away from my mother and father-in-law, who were great people. And over the course of time, me and my father-in-law, we've gotten closer. You know, we would talk about a lot of stuff and do a lot of things. But one of the main reasons why that happened is they were getting older in age. My father-in-law is a 6'5", like 300-pound guy. And he was at this time probably in his late 60s. And as time progressed, he ended up having to be in not a wheelchair, but he used one of those motorized scooters to get around. Obviously, he could walk, but he could take a few steps and so forth. There were a few occasions where he would fall down, and thank goodness, because we lived right around the corner, if anything transpired, I would come and I would help him. So there were probably 2 or 3 times where I had to help him. He fell down on the floor. Obviously, my mother-in-law was nowhere near strong enough to pick up a 6'5", 300-pound man. And so I would go over there and I would help him out with regards to that. And as time started to progress and he started getting older, he started needing more help. So within our relationship, I would come over there if he was about to go to a doctor's appointment or go to the store or do anything with regards to that. I found myself going to the house and sort of kind of helping him get into his car, helping him go around. And as we started talking, our relationship got more and more close. And I think I brought up the subject of his credit. So I'm going to tell you guys how the universe and how God works with regards to how things transpired with us buying our first home. On this specific date, as normal, I would go and help him in the car, help him get his legs into the car, and he could still drive. A very smart man. And we started talking about credit. You know, I asked him, I said, hey, do you know what your credit score is? And he, had the app on his phone and he looked and his score was in like the high 500s. And I thought to myself, I wonder why his credit's the way it is. And so I convinced him, I said, hey, you know what? Let me pull a copy of your credit report. Let me look at your credit and figure out what's going on and figure out what we could do to fix it. And he was like, okay, no biggie. So he signs up for Smart Credit. So those of you who want Smart Credit, that's the one that I like the most. Down below is in the description. I look at his credit report. And as I'm looking at it, there aren't any collections. He had about 4 credit cards that were maxed out, and he had 2 late payments. And the late payments were on credit cards that he had for like 7 years. So as I talked to him, I told him, I said, hey, if you pay down your credit limits, which he probably had about $30,000 at this time worth of credit, and he was maxed out like $25,000 of that, like 95% utilization on his credit cards. And I said, I can get rid of these late payments. And I sent off goodwill letters to the company to get rid of those. And for those of you who want a copy of my free letter bundle, in the description, you can get that to get rid of late payments. And within a month's time span, they took off those 2 late payments. Over the course of the next 3 to 4 months, he started paying down his credit cards. He had a really good amount of money that he was making. The issue was he was spending his money doing something else and not taking care of the bills, and he just didn't really care. He figured if he was making the monthly payments, everything should have been cool. 3 months into it, after we got rid of the late payments, and as you guys know, 1 late payment has the ability to drop your score 50 to 100 points, and he had 2 of them. We got rid of both of those late payments, and he paid his credit cards down to 50% utilization. All of a sudden, he's seen through Smart Credit that his score shot up like 100 and something points. And he was like, oh my gosh. He let me know, hey man, I'm at like 660 on my credit scores. And eventually, he paid all his credit cards down to a 0 balance, and he had no late payments. He had a FICO score of about a 750. And so as I'm looking at his credit, I noticed he had financed a car, but his interest rate on his car was like 20-something%. So after looking at his finances, looking at everything that was going on, I told him, number one, to open up an account with a credit union, which he did. Then I told him to refinance the car, and he couldn't believe it. His payment went from, I think, like $800 to $400 because now he got an interest rate at like 3%, and he was so ecstatic. Moving on with regards to buying the home. As time was progressing, his health wasn't getting better. He was needing more and more help. So my mother-in-law and father-in-law end up hitting me and my wife up and saying, hey, how do you guys feel about moving together? They had mentioned renting a home. So we were going to look for a house to rent a home. And a light bulb went up in my mind. And as I thought about it, I said, when we're looking at rentals, I was like, why would we want to rent a home, which the monthly payment is going to be close to what the mortgage payment can be? Why don't we try and buy a home instead of renting a home? And they thought that that was a great idea. They owned a home previously before. They ended up having to sell it. But now if we're all going to move together, it made more sense to me to buy a home instead of renting a home. I knew, because my father-in-law was in the military, that he could get a VA loan. We had a time frame with regards to moving, right? Our time frame, 3 to 6 months, we wanted to try and purchase a home, which is a lot different than renting, because when you rent, it's a lot easier. When you purchase a home, there's a whole plethora of other information with regards to what you need. I said with the VA loan, given the time frame, we wouldn't be able to put much money down, and with the VA loan, we wouldn't have to put a down payment on the house. We would just have to pay closing costs. And after doing some negotiating and talking with my mother and father-in-law, as well as my wife, we said we'll split the closing costs down in half. Because of me as an entrepreneur, one of the biggest mistakes that I made over the course of doing taxes is writing everything off. My mother and father-in-law being retired, they both had pension plans, as well as my father-in-law was getting disability from the military. They were making enough money. So I told them, go and see what you can get approved for. They got approved for a large amount. My mother-in-law, her credit was A+. My father-in-law's credit was bad, but once I cleaned up the credit and helped them out with that, both of them had A+ credit. Plus, they were bringing in a nice amount of money each month. So we went looking to purchase a home. We found the 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom home in California. Thanks to family group economics, we were able to pull together our resources. So it wasn't necessarily the money aspect, but the knowledge that I had with regards to credit. Because if we didn't clean up his credit, I'm not sure if he would have been able to be approved for a home, or they would have told him he would have to take care of a lot of that stuff, or we would have got a higher interest rate. And then all we did was split the stuff down the middle. So the mortgage is split down the middle, as well as the closing costs that we had to pay. We split that down the middle, and we were able to get inside of a home. Now, a year ago, unfortunately, both my mother and father-in-law passed away on the same exact date. The great thing is the house was in a trust, so it was easy to actually transfer that to my wife, and we are still living in that home today. I was learning about this all the way from the age of 12, and finally I was able to actually utilize it within my family. For those of you who are trying to buy a home, unfortunately, with high prices and competition and so forth, it may be a lot more difficult to get into that home. But if you can get with a brother or sister or something along those lines, make a plan, come together, pull your resources together, you guys can get in that first house a lot easier. And then as you get into that first house, as long as you guys make a plan, every single family that starts out similar to my friend when I was younger, it may take some time, but you guys can all get homes or get money, pull money and invest with regards to having your own bank and starting businesses and helping each other out in that aspect. But this is how family group economics helped me to purchase our first home that we actually live in now. And that was thanks to us being able to come together. If you have any questions, put them down in the comment section. I promise I'll answer those questions. And like I always state, you be great.